Our last presenter today is Dr. Seth Naeve. He is a soybean agronomist with the University of Minnesota and an associate professor in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. He also leads the Soybean Production and Physiology Project, which focuses on surveys and research. Dr. Naeve addresses soybean quality, dynamic geographic variation, quality measurement, and agronomic practices to increase soybean quality. Let's welcome Dr. Naeve.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I can't hold my coffee, I guess, too. This the green light is kind of intriguing here, so it does keep me focused. I guess it was bothering people if I faced it this way, but we're going to stay on focus this way. Again, I'm Seth Naeve, and I do have an interesting position in Minnesota. I've kind of carved out a little niche working on soybean composition and quality. But today we're going to talk all on the production side. I know you're familiar with many of my colleagues, and so I don't get around in this neighborhood very often, so I really appreciate the invitation to come here today. In fact, Stephanie asked me to come here many months ago, and I don't remember the conversation of how we fell into this topic, whether it was me or her. But anyway, I had to put this together in the last few days. And I really ended up with something that was really highly physiological and a bunch of crop physiology theory and a bunch of other stuff. And I ended up pulling most of that out. But that is going to be underlying a lot of the presentation today. And so I feel a little bit humbled by the fact that Illinois has had a lot of really good crop physiologists over the years. I really admire your current soybean agronomist, Giovanni, but I'm also really, I've also had a real reverence for both Emerson and Fred in what they've done for the science over the years. And so I don't know if I can add anything beyond their experience and knowledge, but I'm going to give you something that's more of my own thinking that's come around for a few years. I feel like I've been around 25 years now in Minnesota. I feel like I understand the crop pretty well for Minnesota. So I'm trying to give you a presentation that's trying to give you an idea of the sense of the soybean crop and the physiology of the crop in a non-geographical context. So I basically pulled out all the Minnesota data. So we're mostly going to talk about stress today, but I think it's important to talk about how yield is formed as well. It's important to know how the soybean plant functions and where those yields come from. So we're going to talk, it's really interactive. We can't talk about stress without talking about yield formation and how we get good yields. And so I'm going to start this thing with kind of with the end, really. So we're going to talk about my own feelings about yield establishment by the farmer. So what can farmers do to increase soybean yields? We're going to talk a little bit about the soybean physiology behind this, but again, I pulled out most of the really heavy theory. And then talk a little bit about water stress. I'm using water stress as a good example for how stress affects soybean, or how stress might affect soybeans, and the evolution of crop plants over time and how they deal with stress. I think it's a nice story. Stephanie asked me to talk about smoke effects, so we're going to talk about it. It's a hot topic, so I'm going to crush it. Okay? Hopefully you won't have to talk about it again after today. And then just a little bit towards the end, I'm going to talk about some very recent research we're doing in my lab around the critical period in soybean. Again, this has a physiological bent to it, but I think it's an important one, and it's timely. So like with the other speakers, I hope that you'll entertain me with some questions as we go. We don't have to get through all this. I'm happy to skip through a bunch of this if we don't, if we get sidelined on anything. So please ask as we go along. I think it'll be more entertaining for you all as well. Okay, so here is my short list for how to establish maximum yield potential by soybeans. So I've been thinking a lot about this winter, about what farmers do to maximize soybean yields. And you'll see this list. I'm talking about variety selection, good soil fertility, narrow rows, early planting, a sufficient population, and soil management. This is what we need to do to position that crop to maximize yields. Now, this might look a little familiar. I don't know how many are there. There are six. So it might rhyme a little bit with these 6 secrets from Fred Below. And that either is because we're both really brilliant guys, or I plagiarized it from him, or maybe this isn't rocket science. Maybe these things aren't that complicated. We're really talking about how to position the crop for maximum yield and how to increase yields. This is a completely separate thing, and I'm going to try to lead you through this a little bit. Farmers really need to do 2 things. They need to position their crop to maximize yields, and then they need to preserve that yield. I hope by the time we get to the end of this, that this notion that we can somehow add yield on top of a soybean crop through some magic potion you purchase at the co-op, we can avoid that discussion. So just a little bit of an aside, I'm going to go way back and talk about a study. I'm not going to go through all the data, but I do want to talk about a study that's 10 years old now. But this was a really nice project that USB funded. This is what we called the kitchen sink trial. And I don't know how much Emerson got around and talked about the kitchen sink work that he did in cooperation with this larger group. But over a 6-year period, we had either 6 or 9 states involved with this project, basically looking at how to increase yields through management. And these were purely agronomic things to do. These were basically off-the-shelf products and management that we could do as agronomists to try to increase yields. And in doing so, and this is some of the work even that came before what Fred did with these kind of studies that he did over time, we had combinations of all of these things on together in order to try to see how much these additional products could, I lost the word, basically go together to plug themselves in to help increase yields. So just really quick, these are the list of studies, and I laughed with Megan a little bit because I said, now there's 2 non-weed scientists that are going to talk about cobra this morning, so I think that's kind of entertaining. But cobra is an interesting one because this is one of those products that has kind of held on there among some farmers, and I brought it in today because I think it's an interesting aspect about stress in soybeans. There's a lot of farmers that have this notion that soybean needs to be stressed a little bit. And cobra is one of the ways that they've thought that they could actually poke the crop a little bit and force it into respond to that stress and end up yielding more in the end. I don't believe in it, but I think it has real biological implications for the crop, and we heard about it with white mold. It's a good example of where it can do some benefit by changing that canopy, tightening that canopy, and opening that canopy. And there's probably some physiology within the individual soybeans that make it a little bit more resistant to some stresses as well, other stresses as well. But just really quickly to go through what we did, we looked at seed treatments, we looked at none or a fungicide alone, fungicide plus biologicals at the time. And then we had, again, at the time, we had some different things that were being sold. At the time, it was these LCOs that were in, the idea was to help poke that soybean plant and make it trigger some resistance mechanisms so it'd be more resistant to stresses later. We had 150 pounds of nitrogen onto the crop. We wanted to make sure that we had enough N because there was there was reoccurring discussions about adding nitrogen to soybean. The good yielding soybean needs a little bit of extra N. It can't fix enough N. We got to add some N. So we added 150 pounds of N. By the way, this blows up your economics. If you're ever running an economic analysis on something and you try to put 150 pounds of N on, that sure screws that up. So Cobra was a defoliant. We put a foliar fertilizer on. Bioforge is a Stoller product, and they claimed it to be an antioxidant. I don't even know if Bioforge is still sold. I think there's new iterations probably. We used Headline and Warrior that were replaced with Preaxor and Endigo later as foliar fungicides and insecticides. So here's a summary of the results, and I'm not going to go into the detail of it. If you want to talk later, I threw some data slides at the very end. We could come back to these if you're really interested. But I think the highlight is this. We had 60 site years total in this study. In the central region, 28% of the locations had something that yielded more than the control. So only a quarter of the sites had any of those treatments, or actually the kitchen sink type treatment that yielded more than the control. So 3/4 of the site didn't do anything for us with all that extra management on top. We got a better response in the north, and honestly it was because we had a lot of aphids around. That prophylactic application of insecticide actually got us something. Even when we didn't have a lot of aphids around, we still got a little bit of a nick, a bump in yields, and that really drove, that one prophylactic insecticide really helped push it in the north, and it really was tied to years when we had aphids. So my conclusions, seed treatments and the early season products really showed relatively little value for us. And again, most of that was in the north. We saw less through the central region that included Illinois. Benefits from the insecticide were really the drivers, again, in the north. And really interestingly for us, and I think this is another big overall example of what we learned from this work, is that there was an interaction with yield level. So the highest yielding locations didn't get any extra benefit from all these additional products. And likewise, the lowest yielding sites weren't saved by any of these additional products or programs that we put on these things. So really, these things were acting individually to protect the yield in the most cases. So what my take home from this is really that only the products that had true pesticidal mode of actions really did anything for us. Again, only those products that we have known pesticidal mode of actions work. So either seed treatment fungicide insecticides or foliar fungicide insecticides. Otherwise, nothing worked for us. Now, I know we did kind of a small sampling, and everybody from industry is going to say, well, you didn't test this one, or you didn't test that one, or you didn't test the other thing. But this is what we found overall in this trial. And when I look at subsequent work that we've done, either individually or collectively, it basically comes back to this kind of thinking on my part. So we also found relatively little, let me come back to this. Did I have it? Yeah, let me come back to this. So what we're really doing out here is we're maintaining these existing yields. These things that we added, there was nothing that we added to promote additional yield from that crop. So in terms of these, the pesticides, we found really relatively little value for prophylactic use. So I'm trying to qualify this just a little bit. So those pesticides did work for us overall in general because they worked a little better than everything else. But we really found little evidence that suggested that we should be putting these things out everywhere. And my feeling is really that these calendar sprays are no replacement for in-field scouting and application. So even when we did get hits from putting these things on prophylactically. I know that had we timed those sprays more appropriately based on pest pressure, we would have gotten even more value from them. Okay, this is another one. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm going to give you a very high-level summary over this because this is Giovanni's working on this project with us. And I'd really like him to talk with you about it at some point, and you could hear from him directly. But we've got a multi-state project going on through our Science for Success team. So this is a group of now about 20 universities, 22 universities, that we have soybean agronomists that get together a couple times a year. We come up with protocols. We design trials for really important research topics that need to be evaluated over broad geographies. And so this is a good example of one where we're testing biological products at a lot of locations. So in 22, we had a test of 9 different biological products versus a check at 50 sites. So we were able to evaluate the exact same products at 50 sites in 2022. 2023, I think it's closer to 70 or 75 sites that we evaluated those products in. So I'll give you the take home. The take home from the work is that we tested biological seed treatments. The biological seed treatments are not an answer for everybody. And in fact, I don't really know that we found really good evidence that they're an answer for anybody. I really went into the trial thinking that we were going to find a couple products that found some real value for certain environments, and they just didn't poke up like that for us. And so we gave these things as good of a test as anybody could or should, and we still didn't find a lot of value in them. So I think this supports my overall message that a lot of these add-on products that are being sold to farmers as yield-promoting products without any kind of real claim for the mode of actions for them, except that they somehow protect the plant in some magical way, don't really work for us very well. So again, the farmer's job is really to set that crop up and then protect that crop at all costs or not at all costs, but at some cost to them through IPM principles. And again, these yield enhancing products, we just don't find a lot of benefit to it. And I know a lot of you think that these universities are just a bunch of conservative old curmudgeons that want to poo-poo every new product that comes out. But we really want to find things that work for farmers. We really want to identify the things that are going to help increase yields. And it's so far that we've had a challenge. And I think part of the other problem with this is that we're being swamped, you're being swamped by numbers. At Commodity Classic last year, I think there was 40 booths of different companies selling biological products. It's the perfect revenue generating source for big companies. It's an ideal set of products that can be generated. There's a low entry measure to be able to get into the market, low risk, and there's a chance for making some real dollars from these things. And so there's a lot of companies that are involved with it. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about crop growth. I know this is probably a little bit too heady for us this late in the morning before lunch, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we get to yield, what makes yield in soybean. And a bunch of the slides I'm skipping basically indicate that what we want in soybean crop is we want that crop to develop as quickly as we can through that early season all the way up to the beginning of seed filling. So all the research has indicated that basically the slope of the crop growth, and if you think about it in the fields, is basically how fast that crop canopies and then how how lush of a canopy does that crop develop and how quickly it develops that canopy. That speed of development is basically the indicator of what kind of yield you're going to get at the very end. There aren't other indicators that do a good job of indicating what yield you're going to have. It isn't canopy closure date. It isn't total canopy biomass. It's actually the rate of accumulation of biomass over time. So probably some of this is an academic point because that integrates a lot of that growing season that's important for us. But it also tells us that we need to have good growing conditions over a long period of time. And I include this because we've got some other topics coming up in just a minute that are important. So the three things that we multiply together are the incident radiation. We have to have light. You know, these are crop plants. They're dependent on receiving light from the atmosphere. So if we look at the crop growth rate, and again, my assumption here is that crop growth is the best indicator of yields in the end. Crop growth rate over the year is going to vary with the incident radiation. On any particular day, whether we have higher or lower radiation is going to have an impact on the crop growth rate. So radiation here is in the black. Crop growth rate here goes up, and actually crop growth rate is in the black. The yellow is the incident radiation. You can see they follow each other over time. But the crop can't absorb light if it isn't green out there. So any of that crop space that has, or that area of where you're producing your crop, where you don't have green soybeans, where that light is striking the soil, that is essentially lost energy to us. We're not gaining anything in the system. The soybean has to capture that light. So intercepted radiation, so we have to have radiation and then we have to intercept it. So you have to have the light and then we have to have green leaves out there to capture the light. And that intercepted radiation has a nice correlation, very high correlation with that crop growth rate. So again, more light, more intercepted light gives us a better crop growth rate. And then there's this thing that we call radiation use efficiency. Unfortunately, this is kind of a catch-all for everything. It basically says how efficient is the crop in turning the light that it's captured into biomass that is growing, that is producing in that crop. So it's basically a conversion of the efficiency of turning light into growth and then eventually into yield. And so there's a lot of variation in this thing. The breeders have all tried to give us soybean varieties that have a better radiation use efficiency, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it. It's leaf angle, leaf size, leaf shape, canopy depth, photosynthetic capacity, efficiencies of the photosynthesis, water use, et cetera, all go into this thing. So it captures a whole bunch of stuff. It basically, though, is a conversion from light captured into biomass produced. So how do these stresses that we're talking about affect the crop growth? It affects all of these things along the way. So all those three pieces that I mentioned earlier are affected by stresses. And I'm going to use drought stress as an example. And this is the number one most important stress for soybeans in the Midwest. Mostly we're looking at dry land production. I see a lot of legs, even through the fog this morning. I could see a lot of irrigation legs in the area. But it's still, overall, it's our number one limiting factor to soybean production in the upper Midwest. And I wanted to use drought stress as an indicator because it's incredibly deceptive, but it's also gives us a really interesting picture about how soybeans and other crop plants have evolved to deal with stresses. Okay. This is a figure from a 1970 text, so it's even older than I am, believe it or not. And they're looking at soybeans, sunflower, and corn. This is kind of a complicated text, or a figure, so we've tried to kind of simplify it. My colleague, Aníbal Cerruto's Argentine guy, works with me, so this happens to be still in Spanish, but we have corn, sunflower, and soybeans. The differences don't really matter to us. I want to show you the biggest parts here. What we're talking about is leaf water potential. Water potential is basically how dry, it's a measure of water status of the soybean leaf. So as soon as we start to get some drought symptoms, that would be right here, right at this point here, we have fully watered soybeans or corn or sunflowers. As we move this direction, this is more and more drought stress. So this is perfectly well watered. This would be 100% water capacity of the soil, no problems at all. As things start to get dry, what happens? We have leaf expansion starts to drop right away. So as soon as there's any even sense that that soybean leaf is getting just a little bit dry, the first thing that happens is the leaf expansion stops, or the leaf stops expanding. So we don't have any further canopy development as soon as we get the slightest bit of drought stress. Okay, this other figure shows photosynthetic level, and these are just based on relative amounts. So this is 100% here to 0, and 100% for photosynthesis. You can see the photosynthesis keeps on cranking out for quite a while. The plant is still continuing to turn light energy into sugars that it can use to grow that soybean plant. You'll notice that we put a line through here from where the soybean plant just starts to reduce photosynthetic capacity. But at that point, the leaf expansion is completely stopped. Okay? So think about this period. The soybean plant is starting to get dry. It quits expanding, but photosynthesis is cranking out. So it keeps cranking along. So what's the plant doing if it's not expanding its leaf, but it's still cranking out photosynthate, cranking out sugars? What's that soybean plant doing with that energy? Roots. It's going to the root, exactly. So that plant is just sending all of that energy down to the root. So this is a perfect response to a stress in many ways. So one is, in response to that stress, it basically is taking all the reserves that plant is using to make leaves, and it's just sending those down to the root. Why is it sending it down to the root? Well, it's probably growing more roots so it can explore more soil and it can find more water in the soil. The other side of that is really important, though, too, is you look at what that canopy looks like. That soybean plant is actually thinking that this little bit of dryness that it's smelling out there might portend something for the future. So it says, hey, instead of continuing to crank out new leaves, maybe we should hang out and be a little bit small here. Maybe we need to reserve a little bit of water or conserve a little bit of water. So what the soybean plant does under some light drought stress does something just like this. It basically maintains itself, reduces leaf expansion, doesn't put on any new leaves, continues to crank out photosynthate to send down to the root to pull water up. Meanwhile, the well-watered plants would look something like this. And you could imagine that if the drought would continue, that this crop here might look a lot better than this one because it's actually ripped through a lot less water. So I use this drought stress as an example of how stresses, common stresses like drought, affect a plant, but how evolution has actually shaped these plants, and some breeding probably has affected this as well, to make them better adapted for those conditions. So stress doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It can position a crop for doing better in the future. But like with drought, these stresses, we have to know what's coming in the future. So going back to the cobra example, we could do something a little like this with cobra. We could spray those things. We could keep those plants a little bit tighter and more upright. If we knew we were going to have drought conditions later, if we knew they were going to be stressed later, then that might be a benefit for us. And I think that's probably why we've had some studies that have shown some benefit to cobra in very limited situations. It's because we've also had some situations where we've had the weather events have actually fit right into that aspect. Okay. Drought stress, or sorry, not drought stress, light stress from smoke. So this is something that I've thought about quite a bit just because I get these same questions, and over time I've always answered with the same type of response based on the physiology that I understand about corn and soybean. Mark Jiske at Corteva was getting these same types of questions over the years. And he put together a really nice report. And I know you probably can't see it, but if you Google Pioneer or Corteva and smoke and corn yields, you'll get a nice report on this. So I would just go ahead and do that. There's a PDF and there's also a website. I think it has all the exact same information. What I've done is I basically lifted his report out. And I'm going to go through some of the slides from his report because I think he does a nice job of laying this out. I heard him give a talk on this just a month ago, and he laid this out very well. And so rather than me putting it in my own words, I'm just going to utilize his text. This is, I mean, just in terms of background on this, it's important to know over time, we've really increased the amount of forest wildfires that we've had in the U.S. In the past, 40 years or so, we've gone basically fourfold the amount of area burned on an annual basis due to wildfires. So this is a bigger problem over time. If we look at the really long range, so we're going back to 1895 here, you can see this figure just shows departure from normal of any particular year, and I think this is California. Yeah, these are California temperatures. So this is deviation from temperature, so 5 degrees warmer to 4 degrees colder. And this is deviation in rainfall, 6 inches above to 6 inches below. So this is hot and dry, and this is cold and wet. They've also highlighted in this figure the more recent years of 2000 and 2020 are the dark dots. And you can see those all are shown in warmer years. So the past 20 years have all been above average temperatures. And if you look at when the worst wildfires were, they occur in this quadrant. So we had both hot years, but also dry years, as you'd expect. But the issue is that we keep clumping down here in this corner, and things seem to be going south and east. Just a figure to highlight the smoke image. So these are satellite images, and this is one day, July 21st of 21. And you can see that we were getting smoke from both eastern and western wildfires converging in the Midwest somewhere or another, and I think that's why we ended up getting so much smoke over such a long period of time, even over multiple years, as we were getting both western and eastern fires. Okay, so there's two pieces to the smoke part. Reduced intensity. So the first thing that everybody notices when they go outside, there's a reduction in light levels. Okay, so this reflects a portion of that sunlight, puts it back into the atmosphere, so we've lost some of that. An important thing to consider here, though, is that corn is slightly more sensitive to reduced light. And physiologically, here's some important things to think about with light intensity in individual leaves. An individual leaf can only absorb between 10 and 40% of the light that's incident from the sky. So if we had a full sun day and we took a soybean leaf and hung it out here, that capacity, that leaf only has a capacity to use about 25-30% of that light incident on it. The rest either gets reflected or it gets transmitted back through that leaf. So that leaf is it cannot utilize all that light itself. And corn can actually utilize just a little bit more of that than soybean. So corn has a little bit higher capacity as a C4 plant than a C3 plant. So we're going to talk about corn and soybean. We're mostly going to talk about corn in this piece, and I think I just want you to know that we're using corn as an example because corn is going to be slightly more sensitive to reduced light levels than soybean, but I think we can transpose the data from either one. The other thing that smoke does is it causes an increased diffusion of the light. And this is the really important piece that affects crop growth. So if you think about sunlight, it's coming from not an infinite distance, but a nearly infinite distance from us. So that sunlight is coming and the rays are essentially parallel. So if you think about you're walking out on the sidewalk or down your driveway on a bright sunny day, what does your shadow look like? You've got these nice crisp edges around your shadow. The light is striking your body. You get a shade from that. And you end up with these nice crisp edges because all of that light is basically coming parallel from the sun. So you've got a very heavily shaded area and then a very light area around that shadow. Or shadows from a building or tree, whatever. If you're out on a hazy day, what do you see? No shadow, right? In these smoky days, you get something kind of in between. You get a bit of a shadow and a bit of not. The tendency is to think that, well, it's because of reduction of that light around the outside. We're just not seeing our shadow. But the reality is what we're doing is we're seeing, I think I have a figure. Yeah, it's not a very good figure, but this represents it as well. What we're seeing is that this light is actually coming in a diffuse pattern. So as the light is striking water vapor, water droplets, particulates from smoke, it's getting broken up, and then we get basically the light is coming in from all angles. So that's why we don't have shadows, is simply because the light is coming in from all different directions. I like this figure, except for those lines should be parallel. They show two different types of particulates in the atmosphere, and they'll break up light a little bit differently. But the point is that instead of striking that object from one direction, whenever we have anything in the atmosphere, again, rain, vapor, or particulates, we get this scattering of light. So what does that do in a crop canopy? Well, what it ends up doing is it distributes that light through the canopy. The easiest way to think about it is that on a pure sunny day, all those leaves on the top of the plant are absorbing all of that light. That light that they can absorb is getting reflected off. Those leaves down within the canopy then basically are sitting in full shade because we've got this crisp shade formed from each of those leaves. Those lower leaves are actually very, very dark. When we get a little bit of diffuse light, we actually break that up and the light penetrates the canopy better. So we've got much better canopy penetration. So the old-time agronomists have always talked about hazy days. Actually, slight haze in the atmosphere will actually be better photosynthetically because we're moving more of that light, distributing it through the canopy. This is the same thing if you've heard corn agronomists talk about upright leaves. It's the same exact principle. We've bred these crops like corn to have very vertical leaves, and the reason we've done that is to be able to share that light. Basically, the light strikes that corn leaf at an angle, and it uses a portion of that. The rest of the light then goes down into the canopy and hits lower leaves. When we get diffuse light, this is exactly the same thing. So you can see what's happening here. I'm laying this out for you. So we have a reduction in light, total light, but that light that's striking the canopy under smoky conditions is more diffuse, so there's an opportunity for us to have a better penetration into the canopy. So what does solar radiation do for us? So reductions in yield can be really significant. So agronomists love to go put out shade cloth over crop plants and see what happens. So this group did this in corn at various times. and they found 50% reduction in yield by putting out shade cloth that reduced the light by 50%. So again, this is just open weave cloth that reduced the light level within the canopy by 50%, and they were actually to reduce the yield as much as 50%. But the timing is really critical. They had to hit it when? Tasseling, right? We all know corn is very, very sensitive to stresses during tasseling. Right at VT, R1, we've got the most stress here, and this is when they saw the greatest yield reduction. But you can see they had, this is the check, and basically the yield data is equally proportional to this. You can see when they stressed the crop either earlier or later, they didn't have much of an effect. So the timing of light stress is important. Okay, so how much does wildfire smoke affect the light? So we know that timing is important. We know that if you have enough reduction in light energy, you can reduce the crop yields. So we do know also that cloud cover can reduce solar radiation by 50% as well. So heavy cloudy days can really reduce things. So even knowing this, you can know that if you have enough cloudy days during the right time of year, you can reduce yields. But we kind of chalk that up to being natural for some reason. We know that cloudy days are part of a normal growing season. They actually hurt us. You know, Randy Dowdy in Georgia, is that where he's at? Part of the reason he can grow tremendous crops is he has 100% sunshine down there. He has very clear days during the right part of crop production. We also appreciate cloudy days because they bring rain that's important for our crops in terms of yield potential. So rain is also important for us from that perspective. So I think that's why psychologically we tend to dismiss cloudy days as they actually end up helping us because they bring sun. So what's the relative effect of smoke? There's a couple studies here, 2 in California and 1 in Ohio State. Over 6 weeks, they saw a 3.6 reduction in solar radiation, but they saw a 34% increase in diffuse light. So they ended up seeing a net increase, very small, but a net increase in photosynthesis. So they reduced light levels, but they had enough of this diffuse light to actually increase photosynthesis. Another study, they found 11% reduction in solar radiation. And then the Ohio State folks, just a couple years ago, they looked back through their data just to see how much light reduction they were getting because of smoke, and it was only 6 to 7%. So even though it seems like there's a lot of reduction in light, I think it's because it's an unnatural kind of a thing to us psychologically, and that's why we kind of impose this idea that it's a more important factor than it is. Okay, there are direct effects that are the third piece to this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this to say that there's pollution effects, there's ozone effects due to smoke, but the reality is our background levels of these things are really, really high already. Our crop yields are already reduced due to ozone damage today, but we don't talk about it because we always have those things. It's in the background. Adding smoke onto this thing just doesn't add any extra, an imperceptible or a minuscule amount of additional damage. Okay, so corn may be more sensitive to smoke, but the value of the increased diffusion of light is probably going to outweigh the reduction in light intensity that we see because of most smoke events. So the net benefit is going to be very, very small for us. We're either going to see a plus or minus, but probably the effect of the smoke is not going to reduce our yields on our corn or soybeans. And there's probably going to be a lot of interactive effects that are too complicated to talk about. And I think a lot of farmers got onto this one this year when it was dry as well, and there was a lot of chatter about smoke actually saving yields because it reduced light intensity, it kept our crops cool, reduced transpiration, maybe we saved a little bit of water because of this. Those kind of factors are going to be involved, but they're really too complicated to kind of nail down in anything like this. So that's my full summary on smoke. Questions? I know I put everybody to sleep. Any questions on smoke damage? What didn't I cover about smoke relative to what you've been thinking about? Okay, we killed it. Okay, source, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this either, but I think it is important for us to think about source-sink relationships, especially relative to the next slide I show. Soybeans, a source tissue is any kind of tissue that provides the resources for another tissue to grow. Basically, it's either sugars created through photosynthesis, or it's minerals that are mobilized from those tissues to help support another tissue grow. Typically, what we think about is a source being a leaf, and the developing flowers, pods, and seeds then become the sink. So the source to sink is really important in soybean. The amount, we talk about source and sink strength is really critical. We need to have a good sink strength there. We need to have enough of a vessel for us to put all the energy into at the very end in order to maximize our yields. And this is something I've been going around and around with some of my colleagues about, is this question about seed number versus seed size in soybean. What's more important? These things get back to source strength, sink strength. They also get back to effects of stress on these various things at various times. This isn't the end all of this. I'm just going to show you this one data slide from a paper recently published. I think this is relevant for us. It basically captures what I'm guessing is kind of the summary on all this. This is one particular study that looked at seed number versus seed yield. And you can see as we increase seed numbers on an area basis, we increase yields. How important is seed size? Well, it's important, but it's not that important, okay? So we had a quick discussion last night about yield evaluations and these crop tours and counting pods for soybeans. And I think everybody knows that soybean yield estimations are difficult, but the Pro Farmer or USDA, everybody else is able to somehow come up with numbers that end up fitting pretty well with our yields in the end. We can argue how well they do, but they do, these pod counts do something. The reason they work is by this. The problem is there is some error in this, and the error around this increased seed number versus yield is because of this. Sometimes we get bigger seeds than others. This is data from 2023. This is, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work on soybean composition. This is just one of the things we measure is seed size. We had areas in central Illinois that had very large seeds. So these are areas that the crop ended up yielding better than anybody expected. If they would have done a pod count in this area, they would have underestimated yields. If you would have gone out in southwest Minnesota, or southwest Iowa, sorry, and done pod counts in August, you would have vastly overestimated yields in that area because they had quite small seed in this area. Why do we have large and small seeds? It's just the way I talk to lay audiences like buyers and things of soybean that are interpreting these yield contests or yield evaluations, is that these relative differences in seed size are just based on the relative conditions of the crop. This doesn't mean we had high yields here and high yields here. It just means we ended up with better conditions at the end of the year than the plant thought it had at the beginning of the year. It's relative conditions of the crop. So we could have put out, it wasn't this year, but low or small seed size can come from perfect conditions very early, then tough conditions later on. It's just the difference in conditions between the middle of the year and the end of the year. So this brings us to this question about the critical period in soybean and how soybean and whether soybean is sensitive to stress and when it's the most sensitive. I mentioned earlier that tasseling period is really important for corn, and again, this is something that we all talk about as farmers and agronomists and extension folks, is monitoring the conditions of the environment and management of that corn crop during tasseling. So this is effects of stress on corn. This is relative yield potentials here. We have the biggest effect, downward effect on yields when we stress corn right at tasseling. Winter cereals, it ends up happening a little bit earlier. But the question is, where does soybean lie within this? And I think the conventional wisdom is just like we all talk about, August makes beans, or late August, early September in my mind. I think most of us kind of repeat these adages a lot. And I think that's pretty well characterized by some early research. This is Dennis Egley at Kentucky, R1 to R5. But that's all the way beginning of July, all the way out through the middle of August. So that's a long period of time. This is an Argentine group more recently. Actually, the slide that I showed earlier is from them. They think this R3 to R6 period is more important, and I think that matches more with conventional wisdom, with what we see in the fields here. That same group, those guys based it on this data, which I think is not very conclusive, but they basically did a meta-analysis of all kinds of studies that looked at stress on soybeans from various times. So here we have VE in the crop, R1, so again, beginning flowering, R3 is beginning pod, R5 is beginning seed, full seed, and then R7 is mature, beginning maturity. What they found is about R5.5 is where we had the largest risk of yield loss in soybean. But the part that I argue with this data in is they had studies that showed you could stress the crop at any period of time and not see anything. They only drew some kind of lines around this by hand and said, you know, this is the extent of the data, so this must be the most important time. This is the average of the data here. It kind of takes a dip, but it's certainly not very conclusive in my mind. So we wanted to look more deeply into this. And the folks in Argentina were really only looking at seed number as well. And I'm a believer that seed size is important for yield. And so we wanted to look at both yield, grain number, and seed size. So of course, a farmer's only really interested in the yield side. But from an academic point, we want to know what happens with seed numbers and seed size. So we did trials in 2022 and 2023. I'm just going to show you the 22 data. The 23 data is exactly like it. We just haven't completed all the steps of the analysis yet, so this is complete, so I'm just going to show you the 22 data. But you can be assured that everything was the same in 23. I mentioned earlier, crop physiologists love shade cloth, and that's what we did. We put out shade cloths on soybeans from R1 all the way to the end. We move these shades about every 8 to 10 days, but we move them at exactly 150 megajoules of energy removed from light energy at the top of the canopy. This way we can actually model this now. So we know how much energy we removed from that system for each of these growth stages, so we know exactly how much effect they would have had. Not only is it the identical amount, but we know exactly how much it removed from each of those treatments. So this is what happens for grain numbers. So let me walk you through this really quickly. Again, each of these treatments represents a shading event for about an 8 to 10 day period during these periods. So we either shaded the crop very early at V3, at V6, R1, R2, R3, 4, 5, 5.5, 6, or 7. Okay. This is what we did to grain number, so seed number. This is really wild. Never expected it, but we actually saw an increased seed number when we shaded these things very, very, very early. So I mean, before R1, we shaded these things and we saw increased seed numbers. We saw increased branching in these crops, and I'm still arguing with the Niebel that I work with about what that really means. I don't think we saw more branching in the earlies, but we saw more pods on low branches with early shading. For some reason, this early shading actually promoted that soybean to put on more pods low in the canopy, and so there was more opportunity for yield to be made when we shaded that. So there's something about this early phase of stress that actually pushed that soybean to put on low pods. And we don't know what this means. We have to track this down. We shaded at R1, no effect. R2, maybe a little bit. But then once we started shading these at full pod, or beginning pod, and beginning seed. So beginning pod is really at a time when I don't consider it really into reproduction yet. I think of the plant more on a mechanistic level, that R5 is really when we start setting seed in the plant. That's when I think of the soybean plant is going into reproduction. R1, 2, 3, 4, we're making a few pods, but the plant has not really invested much in the machinery for reproduction, and it still puts on more leaves. We're still putting on leaves until all the way out to this R5.5 period. So you can see we reduced grain number when we stressed crop at the very beginning. It makes some sense. This is when the plants are putting on little pods. The reality is what we're probably doing is we're aborting individual flowers. Soybean, once it makes a pod that's a 1/4 inch long or so, it's going to see that thing to the end unless it gets really nailed by stress. Soybean is going to abort all of its flowers if it's stressed, but it's going to retain any little pods because it's already started to invest in that. And so again, there's some evolutionary mechanism here where once that investment's made, it's going to maintain those little pods. So stress early on reduces our seed number. By the time we got out to R5, 6, 7, that shade didn't end up affecting seed number at all. How about seed size? Well, you can already see that we got something quite a bit different. When we stress these early on, you get a reduction in seed size. Okay, so I mentioned source strength, sink strength early. Maybe this will come around in your mind to think about why this might happen. Why did we have a reduction of seed weight when we stress these very early on? I haven't given you many opportunities to chime in. Why did we reduce seed numbers or seed weight when we stressed the crop, when we had this very early stress? Does it make any sense? Seed number went down, even though we shaded these things at V6, V3, V6. Megan, do you know? We saw reduced seed size. We saw reduced seed size because we had made more seed. We put on more seed, and the plant didn't have the capacity to fill those additional seed. This crop was source limited. Okay? The crop was not seed number limited. The crop was source limited. If we put on an extra pod, it just meant that all the rest of the seed are going to have to be a little bit smaller. Okay? We saw increases in seed weight when we went out to R3 and then back down to reduction. So the real question that we have is really what does this impact, what's the impact on yield? So this is what happens. If we make more pods early on, we don't have the capacity to fill them. We basically have flat yields. We start to reduce grain number, and once that grain number gets low enough, then we actually can increase the seed size proportionally. So we have no effect on yield all the way through R3. We can push seed numbers in a big way, and the seed size tends to react to it, but the yield effect is flat. So the soybean's able to compensate. So again, this idea that soybean is pretty resilient crop, I think, is maintained with this idea. And the crop just deals with it. But what it tells me is that we didn't have any extra capacity to put on extra yield, even when we had extra seeds. But that's not the real part of the story. The real question of the story is, when was the big yield effect? And this is what we were after. It's right here. We had the greatest yield effect at R5 to maybe close to R5.5, because at this point we had both a reduction in seed number and seed size. So one of the other kind of odd things about this, though, is looking at green stems. Does any folks in this area have any problem harvesting green stems in the fall? Common complaint? Is it field-wide? Is it a few plants here and there? Is it only where you put fungicide on?
Depends on the season.
Depends on the season? Well, I think so this is a paper we just wrote. It hasn't actually been released yet, but the Science for Success team is going to have this out. It's just a 2-page, very high-level discussion about green stem disorder. And so that'll be available sometime in the next month or so. But what we did see was something very interesting in this particular study. We saw the greatest number of seed green stems right at R3. This is also when, well, you can see it here. This is also when our seed size was maxed out. So this plant actually had enough resources to max out the seed size, and it wasn't able to increase yields anymore because it was limited on seed numbers. So what I think is going on in this thing is we're basically, these crops are limited by seed number at some point, and this is the case where this probably happened at R3. We didn't have enough seed out there. The plant has resources to fill those seeds, and the resources end up piling up in the stem. So you've got sugars, mineral nutrients that hang out in the stem. There's just not enough place for them to go. Nobody's ever really published on this yet, but my feeling is that we've got situations where we have stress early in the season, maybe as early as R3, maybe drought conditions in Illinois, improved conditions later. The plant recovers, but it doesn't have a large enough seed set to actually really maximize yields. You end up with very large seeds, but you would have had a better yield had you had a better seed set. Now, the point's probably a little bit moot because we had stress. The crop didn't think it was going to be able to maintain all the seeds it had, so it probably aborted some early flowers. We didn't get the seed numbers that it could have supported, knowing what kind of nice conditions we had later because of rainfall. So I think we might be able to use green stem as an indication of when stresses came and when they recovered. But this is really pretty early into this. But this is it basically supports some of the arguments that I've had physiologically about what might be behind green stem. So I'm going with it because I like it. But we'll see where it goes. So anyway, the most critical stage here is really this R5 stage. I thank you. I'm sorry I kind of put you to sleep with my physiological presentation late in the day. We probably should have scheduled me first thing in the morning. But if there are questions, I'd be happy to talk about those. We can address any of those as we go here. Before lunch, I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
You said early on that you didn't see a benefit from seed treatment, and that was from data from 10 years ago, correct? Do you see different now with the earlier planting? It seems like the seed treatment maybe has more of an effect in the planting.
The question about seed treatment and whether we're getting whether we should expect a better response from seed treatments now because of early planting. I've done a gajillion studies on seed treatments. The long story is when we first started doing seed treatment work, the companies came back to us and said, you're not getting good responses because you're not planting early enough. So then we planted really early, and I'm from Minnesota, so we plant, and when we plant early, it takes at least 3 weeks for the soybeans to emerge. So we've put them under significant stress for a long period of time. And then we don't get a response either. It looks like there is a sweet spot for seed treatments, and I don't think I don't think this is very helpful to you, I'm sorry, but I'll give you the academic view. I think when we plant very early into cold soils, our soybeans take too long to emerge to have really useful, or able to take advantage of the actives in those. We've lost a lot of the active ingredients over that period of time. Now, you've got much warmer soils, even though you're planting maybe in April, even than we have planting in late April in Minnesota. So maybe you're not in that situation. But too early, I think we outlive the seed treatment. When we plant into warm, good soil conditions, we have too good a conditions and the plants just pop out and they didn't need the seed treatment. I think there's a sweet spot where we take 10 days to 2 weeks to come out, where seed treatments might work for us. The other place the seed treatments work is when we plant and then we get an inch of rain after. The reason is that we move that product down through the soil profile. It helps protect the root. And we physically moved the product off of that seed down into the rhizosphere around where that root's going to grow. When we have perfect conditions, what happens? The bean pops out, brings the seed coat with it. We have the soil's covered with nice pink and purple and blue seed coats everywhere. It's not doing us any good on the soil surface. I think there's a positional problem with seed treatments, and there's some systemics, and the insecticides are actually pretty good, and actually the fungicides are pretty decent too. If you can get some systemic activity, that will help, but there is a big positional problem with them. And that's actually my biggest problem with the biologicals, is I don't think they're where we need them to go. So I haven't seen any results that say that we've improved the response to seed treatments. I think there's a belief that there is, but I haven't seen it. I'm not going to say there isn't, but I just haven't seen the results.
So if the critical period of soybeans is around R5, and going back to the beginning of your presentation about the yield enhancers and how you find limited results there, I don't know very many people are putting those yield enhancers on at like that critical period versus on corn. Well, everybody's spraying at VTR1, right? So has there been testing at that kind of later period for soybeans on those?
I like that question. That's really a good question. And no, I think a lot of, there's a couple things going on. One is some of these things like we need good penetration of the canopy for a lot of these products, like the fungicides to work. We need to get them on early so that they're there when we have problems. So we're putting these things on before. So an R3 application isn't too much of a stretch to think that some of these things we need an R3 application to help us at R5. The cynical view, and you've heard a lot of cynicism from me already, I'm sorry, but the cynical view also is that nobody really wants to be out in soybean canopies at R5 driving around. And so we know we know what the yield loss is from driving down a canopy at R5, and so we have to have something that benefits us enough to be able to counteract that effect. And so that's the other side of it. So there's not a lot of push for products to go on that late. And again, I think the more important point is that we need to be ahead of that stress period with anything that we would put on. So I didn't fully answer that, but did I answer it enough? Do you think I've got more?
I'd just like to see some later testing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that's good. I think you're right. Yes.
I may not remember the data well, so share what you know, but the state specialist in Wisconsin is a big proponent, soybean specialist, of inoculants.
Oh, yeah.
I'm also a big proponent of at least a fungicide and insecticide. And they shared data that talks about like a 1.8 bushel response against untreated soybeans with F&I. And then the inoculant, something that was above a bushel now.
Yeah.
Maybe statistical relevance is not there, but
So Dr. Connolly, through this biological trial that we're all part of, has changed his tune a little bit on inoculants based on last year's data. So if you really, really listen carefully, yes, he's promoting use of inoculants, but he said, we got this benefit because it was a dry year last year, and he thinks that's the response. And I've looked at the data, and it's really one site. Sean uses some very liberal statistics with things, and he's a good proponent of some of these things. I can't disagree with him on inoculants, because I for one would say inoculants is one of the, for taking the Hippocratic oath here, do no harm. Inoculants aren't going to kill you. It's only a couple bucks. And there's nothing in there that's going to have any downside biological consequences for us for the future. So I am not against inoculants. I'm just kind of surprised that he's already been so positive on them, because he and I wrote a really thorough paper that said they didn't do anything for us, and now he's got a really nice positive response. So it's pretty typical. And I don't know. He is a little bit more positive on the foliar fungicide than I am. They've just seen a little bit more response on the Wisconsin side than we have in Minnesota on it. We don't have that much different environments, but I think he's just picked up a little bit more. But again, what we're talking about is he's talking about 1 bushel increases, and I'm really thinking that we need to see a couple bushels in order to know that something really works. I want assurance that it's going to work for you. And I know farmers hear a bushel and they say 12, 14 bucks. That's good. I see 1 bushel and say, nobody really knows where a bushel is. Nobody can measure a bushel. A bushel is kind of a phantom out there that we're chasing. And so I know it fulfills this idea that I'm an old cynical curmudgeon about things and I need to have 95% confidence interval on these things. But I think in order to ensure farmers that things are going to work well, I want them to be pretty satisfactorily tested. That was a pretty harsh tone for Sean. We need to send him a copy of this. Oh, it's probably all over Twitter already. He doesn't have time to watch me, but he can see the last 5 minutes of this. Okay, you guys need lunch. Is there one last quick question? Yes, sir.
So obviously I'm an agronomist for a local retailer, and so we go back to the beginning of your talk, and you talked about the 6 things that we need to be looking at. So if I feel that on my growers fields the high management grower that I believe is looking at these things through a fine-tooth comb, what camp do we need to be looking at if this guy wants to take yields to the next level? I mean, where do you believe that we need to be? I mean, I know you're researching some of this stuff, but
I thank you for boiling it down. I mean, I rambled for an hour, and I think this gentleman has perfectly encapsulated the question. What can farmers do to increase yields? If you're already doing everything right, why can't you go from 70 to 80? Is that what we're talking about? Or
I'm shooting for 100 bushel beans. That's what my growers are asking for. And I'm to the point now where there's things I'm trying, but just like in your researches, you see it work one year and it's not the other, and inoculants and this and that.
So the question is absolutely right on target. We're all frustrated with this crop because it won't behave the way we want it to. We can throw money at it and it doesn't respond to that, and we're frustrated by it. And I think that's just part of the deal in this crop, is that we really have to have things all come together right. There's a lot of unknowns. That's why we're studying a lot of these narrow things like this critical period. We're looking at maturity groups, trying to identify how to move varieties and planting dates to avoid some stresses so that we can fit in the right spot. There is not one thing that a farmer, I don't think that a farmer that does everything else right that I talked about, the basics. If you do everything right, you just have to have good weather and things have to go right for you at the end of the year. But I do, I'm open to fungicide applications. I'm open to, putting insecticides out there. I think those things work. I just don't think this idea that just because you have good yields already and you want higher yields, it doesn't give you, it doesn't open the opportunity to buy yourself higher yields by adding one of these other products. It doesn't come that way. Soybean, I think if you want to have the real answer on soybean, what my gut feeling on soybean is managing. If we could identify what the perfect canopy structure was with soybean for a particular environment, we want to have X, tons of biomass, or a soybean that's, up to your armpits or whatever the measure is, relative to the yield potential. I think that's the next opportunity for us as breeders and physiologists to understand what the perfect growth habit for soybean is for a particular location. Because what dings us on yield is we either get too big and too leggy, they make too much biomass and then we don't have any yield, or we're not big enough, the soybeans just stall out, and we don't have enough nodes, we don't have enough pods on there to fill out. It's back to this sink source question, but that's really a messy thing, and it's because the crop doesn't respond exactly like we had expected to, and we never know what kind of year we're going to have in the end. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question at all.
We're potentially finding some kind of a cap here to an extent, without knowing environmental conditions, what we're going to have, correct?
We're capped by the breeders because soybean is a tough crop to breed. It has a really genetic heritage. We're basically have 17 lines we brought from China, that everything is based on those, and I think five of those original accessions make up like 85% of the germplasm. So we just keep crossing the same stuff. We don't have this hybrid capacity to bring in new genes and make crosses like we do with corn. We're just recycling. The breeders are basically recycling all these same crosses, and they're hoping they come across something that does something a little bit better. But we're really limited by the genetics of the soybean crop. And so the big things are really going to come someday when we have real genomic enhancements to soybeans. But we're really a long ways from that, because all the stuff that's going to work for us is really complicated. And so far the breeders have only been able to put one gene in at a time. So I'm going to hang out for a few minutes. I got to get back to O'Hare, but I'll be around for a few minutes on the beginning of lunch. So please stop up and chat with me. But I'll turn it back to Stephanie.